Hello, today is Friday, January 3rd, 2026. I am Cindy Allen, CEO of TradeForce Multiplier, a global trade consultancy service where we handle everything from high-level strategy and risk determination to everyday classification and valuation projects. Welcome to Simply Trade, Cindy's version, where I base an international trade update on a Taylor Swift song. This podcast is brought to you in association with the Global Training Center. Today's song is The Moment I Knew, which is off her Red album, and I'll get into that in a moment. But first, what happened in trade this week? Well, we saw an announcement late last week, early this week, that Canada and China are finalizing an agreement, a trade agreement, because Canada does feel that trade with China is important. It has become their number one trade partner. So they want to make sure that that reputation or that relationship continues moving forward. We've also heard that a massive delegation of EU countries are traveling to Asia, including China, Vietnam, and other areas, to explore a trading bloc trade agreement, so a unilateral agreement between the EU and Asia to further trade relations moving forward. We haven't seen any details on that, but we do know those talks are ongoing and that high-level officials are meeting both in Europe and in Asia. In good news, the administration did roll back the threat to impose additional tariffs on countries, on the NATO countries specifically, that opposed the administration's proposal to take over Greenland. Buying it, the administration further outlined that they have no intent to actually do that in a forceful nature, which is also good for everyone here in the U.S. and in Greenland. Also good news for the NATO countries that now don't have to contemplate taking further actions in retaliation for additional tariffs that really involved a sovereignty issue with Greenland. Legislation has been heating up. I did touch on the fact that there was a Cassidy bill that was introduced last week. We've also seen some legislation around imposing import licensing structures into anyone who wants to import into the U.S. Also included in that bill was language around non-resident importers and restricting those. The import licensing regime really was seen to be facilitating a trusted trade program or a trade agreement with individual companies that would meet a higher level of compliance and therefore have lower tariffs. But now, upon reading that language, many in the trade are worried that this is going to be an overall import scheme to assess tariffs to those companies and countries that would require an import license, and there would be some fee to get that, and only those individuals would be able to import those. So we aren't quite sure what the intent of the legislation is, depending on what lens you're reading it through, but concerning. Also, a bill was introduced on the express courier clearance process, posing a 20% flat rate that kind of mirrors the postal service process that was meant to replace the de minimis process, where a postal service pays either a 20% flat rate or the IEPA tariff that is imposed on the country where that mail or those international packages are coming from. We'll see if that moves forward. It does. The legislation as it is proposed right now only applies to express couriers, as they have had a massive impact on the elimination of de minimis. Not only was the majority of their importations de minimis in nature, but now they have to convert that to entries, which has had a huge impact on their profitability. Many of the express couriers in their financial statements have come out and indicated a massive impact due to the elimination of that. FedEx in particular, most recently saying there was a $1 billion headwind due to that elimination. So this is very important to the express industry so that they can get back to a normal type of environment where they are not having to do a full entry on goods that really aren't that expensive, still fall in the lower range. And if you remember, the average value for de minimis shipments in 2024 was actually around $25. So You can imagine the massive amounts of shipments that are coming in, under $100, around $25, and having an entry being done on each one of those has to be a big impact on those companies. So we'll see if this moves forward to ensure the financial viability of what are essentially two very big U.S. companies with a lot of U.S. labor attached to it. We also saw some reports that AGOA and the Haiti Help Act may be extended, but only for 1 year. I haven't reviewed language of that today to see if that was actually included in any of the budget bills that were passed in the last 24 to 48 hours. But hopefully those bills are extended, because that's really important to those areas that are continuing to try to develop their individual economies. Again, the Supreme Court decision was not announced. The Supreme Court is out of session for the next 4 weeks. So the soonest we anticipate getting any type of announcement or any type of decision is mid to late February. And the longer that this goes on, the longer that the Supreme Court takes to make this decision, the more I wonder if we aren't going to see a decision anytime soon, that the Supreme Court is going to try to delay this until they go back out of session in October. We may see some decisions. We may see a decision. Nobody knows. Again, this is all guessing by everyone, but I'm wondering if we are in for a big delay. So those companies that are betting on the fact that they're going to get some relief for tariffs, I'm afraid this is going to be a long journey for us. And even then, if the Supreme Court does come out with a decision, we don't know what that looks like. Does that mean everyone gets that IEPA duty deposited back in their bank account immediately? No, it doesn't. We do know that there will be a process attached to that, but what that process is and how long it will take, we don't know yet. That's going to be dependent on the Supreme Court decision and the manner that it comes down. So again, still on IEPA watch. We are still seeing an increasing 28 requests for information from CBP and enforcement actions, specifically around the 232 on aluminum and steel. There were some indications in the past, week or so that the Base Metal Center has given some verbal but not binding advice that you basically take the value of the good, back out raw material costs for everything but the steel and aluminum, and everything else is subject to the steel aluminum 232 duties, which seems a little backwards to me. It seems to me that the only thing you would take out is the value of the steel and aluminum. Specifically, AAEI is going to have a subgroup look at this, a work group look at that, and continue to work with CBP to try to understand the precedent that it's setting here and also the decision, so the importers can just make sure that their transactions are compliant, which is really important moving forward. So today's song, The Moment I Knew. Why did I pick that off the Red album? Well, in this song, Taylor talks about the realization of something. And in her case, it was the realization that a relationship was ended. And I think that's really important because this week, Davos, however you pronounce that, happened in Switzerland. And this is a massive meeting of both government officials and high-level CEOs, multi-billionaires that are changing the industry and are invited to attend this forum. Exclusive, but also very high power. And we see most CEOs of major corporations, the top, the Forbes 100 attending this event, as well as some up and coming types of companies that have made a big impact in their area of operation. And we did see that, the U.S. administration showed up with their America First agenda, and it was not well received. There were some active booing by the audience in attendance, and the reaction of the other nations and attendees were very negative overall. And the volatility of this Davos was really surprising, I think, for those of us who've watched it over the years and the messages coming out of there. usually it's centered on how can we move an industry forward? How can we move an economy forward? How can we move, a social platform forward like climate change? How can we address that globally, both from a government and a company perspective? But what we saw at this forum was really the reaction of the other nations and of the attendees, both government and non-government, was really a message of unity for the economies to establish trade and trade agreements outside of the U.S. And I think that really was the moment I knew that the rest of the world, globally, global trade is up. And there continues to be a high level of trade among governments and among the peoples that live in these countries. And they have come together with a message of unity that they're going to move forward. And we see that with the fact that, Canada and China signed an agreement. The EU and Asia are looking at a trade bloc agreement. And I think one of the biggest moments that I knew was when Canada the Prime Minister had the strongest and most direct message of a sense of betrayal, of a sense of betrayal of a friend that they have worked with and have had great relationship with. And it was like Canada, it was their demonstrated moment that they knew that the relationship had changed and is possibly changing in a way that is not going to be repairable in the near future. That the moment that Canada knew and all the other governments and economies knew that we aren't going back. This is not going to change when we get to the midterms. This is not going to change when we are through with this administration. We're almost at a point of no return where you know that your relationship has fundamentally changed. And regardless of who is in that relationship, it's not going to be the same moving forward. We are seeing very strong evidence that the world is trading around us, and we are not going to have the gravity that we did before because the rest of the world has realized that something has fundamentally changed and are continuing to move forward without the U.S. And I think there was a lot of dismay by the attendees of how strong the rift has become. And so possibly it's the moment I knew everything has changed. We'll talk to you next week.